Dorothy Calloway had been showing people photographs of her son for 6 years. She did it the way some people say grace before meals or check that the door is locked before bed, as a ritual so embedded it had ceased to require a decision. She showed Marcus Jr. to her hairdresser, and to the woman at the pharmacy counter, and to the man who fixed her air conditioning unit last July, who had not asked, and who had listened with the careful attention of someone who understands that this is not a conversation about her son so much as a conversation about the specific gravity of losing him. She had shown the photograph to strangers on airplanes, and to the cashier at the Piggly Wiggly on Oxmoor Road in Birmingham, who knew her by name, and who had, by now, heard enough about Marcus Jr. to feel she had known him herself. She showed him to people because showing him to people kept him in the world. She understood that this was not a rational position. She held it anyway. The photograph was taken at Marcus Jr.'s 26th birthday party, 2 years before he died. He was grinning in the particular way he grinned, wide and slightly sideways, the grin of a man who found the world genuinely funny and wanted everyone to know it. He was holding a piece of cake. He was wearing a red shirt. He looked, in the photograph, like someone in the middle of a long and happy life. He had died on October 11th, 2019, in a car accident on I-20 near Bessemer, Alabama. He was 28 years old. He had been an organ donor since he turned 18, had told Dorothy about it when he got his first driver's license, had said, "Mama, if something happens to me, somebody else should get to use what I've got." Dorothy had said, "Nothing is going to happen to you." He had said, "I know, but just in case." She had not known, in the 6 years since, who had received what he had given. She knew that his kidneys had been donated. She knew that his heart had gone to a woman in Georgia. She knew, from the brief notification the organ procurement organization had provided, that his kidney had saved the life of a 34-year-old man in Louisiana. She did not know his name. She had written a letter to the recipient family through the organization in 2020, offering contact if they wanted it. She had not received a response. She had told herself this meant the recipient had moved on, had built a life, had not needed to reach back. She had tried to be glad for this. She had not stopped showing people the photograph. On November 12th, 2025, Dorothy Calloway sat backstage in the green room of the Family Feud studio in Atlanta, with her daughter, Vanessa, her son-in-law, Gregory, her grandson, Terrell, and her granddaughter, Zara, who was 9 years old and who was wearing the dress with the pockets, because Dorothy had told her she could bring one small thing, and Zara had put the photograph she kept of Uncle Marcus in her pocket, in case she needed it. Which she thought she might, because she always found she needed it more than she expected. Across the hall, in a separate green room, James Newen was sitting with his wife Lynn, his brother Peter, his sister-in-law Mai, and his mother, who had flown from Houston, and who had said, when James told her they had been selected for Family Feud, that this was good news, and that she wanted to come, and that she was not taking no for an answer. And James had said he knew better than to say no. James Newen was 34 years old. He had received a kidney transplant on October 14th, 2019, at Tulane Medical Center in New Orleans. The kidney had come from a 28-year-old man from Alabama who had died in a car accident. James knew the donor's first name, Marcus, because the transplant coordinator had told him, gently, that the family had consented to share that much. James had not known the last name. He had tried, in the years since, to find the family, not intrusively, not in a way that would intrude on their grief, but he had wanted them to know that Marcus was still here, in the specific way that mattered, that his kidney was working, that the decision Marcus had made at 18 on a driver's license had meant that James Newen was alive to marry Lynn and be present at his nephew's first birthday and eat his mother's pho on Sunday mornings. He wore a bracelet on his left wrist. He had worn it since the transplant. It was a simple leather cord with a single metal tag stamped with a date, October 14th, 2019. The date the transplant had occurred. The date he considered his second birthday. The date Marcus had made possible. He had not found the family. He had placed the search in the category of things that might happen eventually, if they were meant to happen. He had no idea that Dorothy Calloway was 40 feet away. Steve Harvey walked onto the Family Feud stage that November morning and introduced himself to the two families, the Calloway family from Birmingham and the Nunn family from New Orleans. He started on the Calloway side, Dorothy first, because Dorothy had the quality of a woman who expected to be addressed first, and who had earned this expectation through 67 years of being exactly the person the room needed her to be. Steve said, "Dorothy, tell me about your family." Dorothy said, "We're from Birmingham. We're loud and we're competitive, and we love each other." She paused. "And I want to show you someone." She reached into her purse and produced the photograph. This was not unusual for Dorothy. She had done it hundreds of times. She held it out to Steve Harvey the way she held it out to everyone, with the directness of someone performing an introduction. Steve Harvey took the photograph. He looked at it. He looked at Dorothy. She said, "That's my son Marcus. He passed in 2019. Car accident. He was 28. She said it the way she had learned to say it, with the particular flatness of something said so many times that the delivery has been worn smooth, though not the meaning, never the meaning. He was an organ donor. Some people got to live because of him. I like people to know he existed." Steve Harvey looked at the photograph. He said, "He looks like he was something else." Dorothy said, "He was everything else." Steve nodded. He held the photograph for a moment longer than he held most things people showed him. Then, he handed it back. He turned toward the Noyne family. Across the stage, James Noyne had been watching. He had been watching the way you watch something when your peripheral vision catches a detail that your conscious mind has not yet processed, but that your body has already responded to. A shift in attention, a leaning forward, an intake of breath that happens before the thought arrives to explain it. He had seen the photograph from across the stage. He had seen, in the photograph, a young man in a red shirt holding a piece of cake. He had seen the hospital wristband visible at the edge of the photograph. Not Marcus Jr.'s birthday photo wristband. A different photograph had slipped in front. One Dorothy also carried. From Marcus Jr.'s last days in the ICU, the two photographs kept together, and on the wristband, partially visible, a date, October 14th, 2019. James Nguyen looked at his own wrist. October 14th, 2019, he looked at Dorothy Calloway. He said across the stage, in a voice that was not a game show voice at all, in a voice that was barely a voice, "Excuse me, ma'am, was his name Marcus?" Dorothy turned. She looked at the man across the stage. She said, "Yes." James said, "From Alabama, a car accident, October 2019. Dorothy went very still. The stillness of someone who has felt the world shift underfoot and is deciding whether the ground is going to hold. She said, "Yes." James Nguyen looked at Dorothy Calloway. He put his hand on his left side, the side where the kidney was, where it had been working for 6 years, where Marcus had been living in the only way that was still possible. He said, "I have his kidney." The studio fell completely silent. Not the silence of a dramatic moment being processed, the silence of 300 people receiving something they did not have a category for, something that did not fit inside any frame they had brought with them that morning, something that could only be held in complete stillness because any other response would have been too small for it. Dorothy Calloway looked at James Nguyen. she said, very quietly. "You're him." James said, "Yes, ma'am. I'm him." Steve Harvey stood between the two families. He had been 4 feet from Dorothy when James spoke, had heard every word, had not moved, and he stood there for a moment with his hand over his mouth and his eyes, doing something they did not often do on this stage. He said, in a voice that was not a television voice, "Stop everything." The floor director stopped. The cameras kept rolling because no one called cut, and no one was going to call cut. Steve walked toward the center of the stage, between the two podiums, between the two families. He looked at Dorothy. He looked at James. He said 5 words, not loudly, in the specific quiet of someone naming something true. This was always going to happen. Dorothy Calloway walked across the stage. She walked the way you walk toward something you have been moving toward for 6 years without knowing the direction. She walked to James Nguyen, and she stood in front of him, and she looked at him. At this 34-year-old man from New Orleans who had Marcus Jr.'s kidney and who had worn a bracelet with a date for 6 years and who had tried to find her and had found her here, in a television studio in Atlanta, on a Tuesday morning in November, because life arranges its most impossible things in the most ordinary containers. She put her hand on his left side, where the kidney was. James covered her hand with his. The studio fell completely silent for the second time. A silence so complete that Zara Calloway, 9 years old, in the contestant seats, could be heard clearly when she said, in the voice of a child naming what she saw with the literal precision of a child who has not yet learned to soften the true thing, "Grandma, he has Uncle Marcus inside him." Dorothy Calloway looked at her granddaughter. She looked at James Nguyen. She began to cry, not the managed, worn, smooth version she had developed over 6 years of saying the words with the delivery rubbed flat. The full version. The one that had been waiting since October 11th, 2019, for a place to go that was not grief alone, but also something else, something that had not existed until this morning. Gratitude with a face, with a name, with a hand over hers on the left side of a man who was alive, because Marcus had said just in case at 18, and had meant it. James Nguyen was also crying. He had been trying not to, and had stopped trying. His wife Lynn had crossed the stage. She had not been asked. She had simply moved. The way you move when your husband is crying in a television studio, in the specific way he cried at home when he thought she was asleep, when the gratitude was too large to hold privately. She stood beside him. She put her arm around him. Vanessa, Dorothy's daughter, had her hands over her face. Gregory had his arm around her. Terrell was looking at the ceiling. Zara was looking at her grandmother's hand on James Nguyen's side with the complete methodical attention of a child who is watching something she will remember for the rest of her life and knows it. Steve Harvey had walked a few paces away. His back was partially to the audience. His shoulders moved. He stood there for a long moment, longer than he had stood that way on this stage before, and the studio held him in the silence, the way a room holds something it is not going to rush. When he turned back, he did not compose his face. He looked at the cameras. He said, "I have been doing this for 25 years. I have been in this studio for 25 years, and I want everyone watching at home to understand that what just happened on this stage was not planned. Not by production, not by these families, not by anyone. These two families drove to Atlanta on a Tuesday morning to play a game show. That is all either of them knew." He stopped. A woman took out a photograph because that is what she does, because showing her son to people is how she keeps him in the world. And a man across the stage saw a date on a wristband, The same date he wears on his arm every day. He paused. I know something about a stranger arriving at exactly the right moment. When I had nothing, when I was in my car, when I thought there was no next thing, a stranger said something to me that changed the direction of everything. I have spent 25 years believing that those moments are not accidents, that they are something else, something that was already arranged, that was always going to find its way to the surface. He looked at Dorothy and James. This was always going to happen. These two people were always going to find each other. Today is when it happened. He was not done. He called the director of an organ donation recipient support network on stage, on the phone, in front of everyone. He said Dorothy Calloway's name. He said James Nguyen's name. He said, "These families need to know each other for the rest of their lives. I want support for that, ongoing, real, whatever it takes to make sure they are never strangers again." He paused. "And I want to establish a program for donor families who have never met their recipients, and for recipients who have never been able to find the family, because this should not require a game show." He looked at Dorothy. He said, "He knew, didn't he? Marcus, when he put down organ donor." Dorothy said, "He said somebody else should get to use what he had." Steve said, "Somebody did." The competing families, the Nguyen family and the Calloway family, who were no longer competing families in any meaningful sense, who were something else entirely that did not have a game show category, stood together in the center of the stage. Lynn had her arm around Dorothy. James had his arm around Vanessa. Zara had taken the photograph of Marcus Jr. from her pocket, the one she had brought in case she needed it, and was holding it in both hands, looking at it, and then looking at James, and then looking at it again, with the methodical attention of a child reconciling two things that have just become one thing. Today, Dorothy Calloway is 68 years old. She still shows people the photograph of Marcus Jr. She will always show people the photograph. But now when she shows it, she sometimes says, "He saved a man's life. I know him. His name is James." And the showing is different now, not lighter. Nothing about grief is lighter, but fuller. The way a thing is fuller when it has somewhere to go. James Nguyen is 35 years old. He still wears the bracelet. He will always wear the bracelet. But now he knows the name that goes with the date, the full name, Marcus Calloway Jr., and he uses it. When people ask about the bracelet, he says, "That's the day Marcus saved my life. I know his family. His mother's name is Dorothy." 3 months after the taping, the Find Each Other Foundation, established through the Steve Harvey Foundation and the Organ Donation Network, had connected 47 donor families with their recipients through a facilitated, voluntary program that provided emotional support, logistical coordination, and ongoing community for families navigating what happened when the anonymous became known. The Foundation's founding principle was simple. Nobody should have to find each other on a game show. A year after the episode aired, the Foundation had served 312 families across 23 states. It had partnered with organ procurement organizations in 6 states to offer opt-in contact facilitation as a standard part of their donor and recipient processes. It had a waiting list, families ready to be connected, waiting for the other family to be ready too. The intake coordinator said the most common thing both sides said when they finally met was some version of the same sentence: "I've been looking for you." Zara Calloway is 10 now. She keeps the photograph of Marcus Jr. in her room on the windowsill next to a photograph she asked her mother to print. James Nguyen and Dorothy Calloway, hands clasped, taken backstage after the taping when the cameras were off and the studio was emptying, and they were still standing there, neither of them ready to let go yet. She looks at both photographs every morning. She has explained to her friends that the man in the second photograph has her Uncle Marcus inside him, and that this means her uncle is still here, in a way, and that the way is enough. Her friends have accepted this with the open-handed acceptance of 10-year-olds who have not yet learned to require the world to be more explicable than it is. Dorothy had said to James, backstage, holding both of his hands, "Does it hurt?" "The kidney. Does it give you trouble?" James had said, "No, ma'am. It works perfectly. It has always worked perfectly." Dorothy had nodded. She had looked at their hands. She had said, "That sounds like Marcus. He never did anything halfway." James had laughed. A real laugh, sudden and full. The kind that happens when something surprises you into it. Dorothy had laughed too. They had stood there in the emptying studio laughing about a man they had each loved in completely different ways, laughing because the alternative was crying, and they had already done that, and this was better. This was the thing that came after. This was two people who had found each other on a Tuesday in November in Atlanta, and who were going to know each other for the rest of their lives. Two hands, clasped. One of them had been reaching for 6 years. The other one had just arrived. If this incredible story of Marcus Calloway and the two families he brought together from either side of the thing he gave touched your heart, subscribe to this channel and hit the like button. Share this with someone who believes it is never too late to find the person you were always going to find, or to know that the thing you gave mattered, specifically to a specific person who is living because of it. Have you ever been reunited with someone you thought was gone? Or found that someone you were looking for had been looking for you? Share your story in the comments. Because as Dorothy Calloway and James Nguyen proved, love does not have an expiration date. And neither does the moment when two people who needed to find each other finally do.